Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. Now we move into the West Africa part of France's colonial history. So, again, basically, West Africa was where a lot of wealth and slaves were extracted from before colonialism really got started. The Portuguese were really the first to begin trading in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and then everyone else in Europe wanted in on the hot new craze of trade. Now, initially, because of so many different diseases that they couldn't really deal with, Europeans mostly stuck to creating trade agreements and establishing forts all along the west coast of Africa from Senegal to about Nigeria. And this is why the various different coasts existed in West Africa. You had the Gold Coast, you had the Ivory Coast, you had the Slave Coast, and you had the Pepper Coast. Guess what? All these lovely things, all these lovely parts of Africa traded in. Now, that's sort of how it started, and then, of course, it just expanded, especially with the settlement of the New World. This is why there's so many black people in the United States, in parts of Canada, in the Caribbean, and of course in various parts of Latin America. So that's where a lot of this begins, but they didn't really colonize things. Sure, they had some conflicts here and there, and then maybe they controlled certain little strips of land or strings of forts along portions of the coast. They were very much outposts and not really much of a proper colonial empire. Not yet, though, but we'll get to that. So, further influence, especially as it relates to the French, who I want to keep as the focus here, it really starts in 1854 with the proper colonization of Senegal. They had taken their initial forts and settlements and now expanded them into an actual colonial empire, and this in part was spurred by their initial successes in Algeria, as well as wanting further control and influence over the various trades that would be happening, because Senegal, specifically also the ports along its western coast, are about where most places would have to start resupplying or make landfall before then deciding which way they're going to go, across the Atlantic or further south into the Gulf of Guinea. And this was a very strategic location for the French, which just added to their reasons for wanting it. But really, at the end of the day, it was about trade and establishing a more permanent base of operations in Senegal. And then this continues later in Dahomey, which is now the Republic of Benin, which is right next to Nigeria. So why did the French want to do this and to conquer West Africa? Well, like with all things and with capitalism, it has to do with money. Remember, these were very profitable regions. They were producing cocoa, sugar, cotton, gold, before the abolition of slavery and the slave trade, slaves. This was basically a cash cow for any European power that was able or willing to fight for it, which ended up being, for the most part, the French in West Africa. The Portuguese and the British, and even at earlier points, the Dutch and even the Danish had settlements, but for the most part, West Africa is firmly French. So I want to talk a bit about how that happened. So the French idea, and to contrast this with the British wanted a north-south African empire. This was the famous Cape to Cairo thing of establishing a telecommunications line from the Cape Colony at the southern end of South Africa all the way to Cairo and the Suez Canal in northern Africa. And the British wanted to connect this not just with the telecommunications line, but also with a rail line. And this conflicted with the French, which they wanted a more east-west axis. Based on their initial holdings in Algeria and Senegal And also over in Djibouti, in the east coast of Africa, at the strategic location in the Gulf of Aden, where it meets and leads into the Red Sea and therefore the Suez Canal. The French very much wanted an east-west axis. They wanted an empire that stretched across the Sahel, that region that I talked to you about, that is sort of the transition zone between savanna and jungle and the large Sahara Desert that takes up most of North Africa. This means that the French needed to expand quickly, but in order to do so, they needed money, which means they needed colonies. And so between their sort of anchor points of Senegal and Dahomey, they wanted to kind of bridge the gap. And so they exploited a lot of, again, terrible treaties that they broke. And then when the natives resisted, they used that as a casus belli to invade, or they exploited internal conflicts between tribes or kingdoms and said, oh, hey, we'll help you overthrow your brother. In exchange, we want you to let us turn your nation or your kingdom into a protectorate. And this is how the French began to just completely dominate West Africa. This is why eventually it got to the point that the French Second Colonial Empire needed to split itself off into different self-governing federations within the colonial empire. And this brings us to the Federation of West Africa. Now, the Federation of French West Africa didn't actually happen until 1895, and it was the unification of Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, the Ivory Coast, Mauritania, Benin, and Niger. This was considered French West Africa, a self-governing federation of these 8 colonial territories. And of course, the French had gone through these, again, skipping over a lot, by various wars and exploitation. But you can also tell that this is clearly about them securing not only their economic crops, but also to connect them to their territories in northern Africa. And with the addition of Niger, shows a clear trend for them heading eastward. Now, this brings us to the Fashota Crisis, or the Fashota Incident, where the French and the British nearly went to war because their rival colonial expeditionary forces met and nearly engaged in conflict in Fashota in Sudan. As history would show, the British would ultimately end up winning, but it damn near came to war in the 1890s. The 1890s are also an interesting part because the 1890s are when you really get the scramble for Africa. So to sort of backtrack a few decades, in the 1870s, Europeans, be they French, British, Portuguese, Belgian or whoever, by this point in time, they only controlled 10% of Africa, and it was mostly along the coast. By 1914, they controlled 90% of the continent of Africa. So let's talk about that for a hot second. So initially, they couldn't really get beyond the coast because of various diseases. And so one of the most important European discoveries was the medicine known as quinine, which allowed them to deal with malaria and therefore allowed for the much easier facilitation and exploitation of the black indigenous populace of Africa. Additionally, at this point in time, we also need to remember that the Industrial Revolution was well underway in Western Europe. So railways, coal power, steam power, these were all things that were happening and allowing for new technological marvels to be used in the great civilizing mission. Because that's what a lot of this was as well. Even though at the end of the day, it really was about money and power and influence, it was also about fixing what they saw as flaws in other civilizations. This is why sub-Saharan Africa is overwhelmingly Christian, and Northern Africa, thanks to earlier Arab expansion and the Ottoman Empire, is overwhelmingly Muslim. This we'll get into a few videos from now, but I still want to focus on the scramble for Africa. The scramble for Africa was made official with the Berlin Conference of 1884, and this was in direct response to King Leopold II of Belgium basically creating the Congo Free State, which was the current Democratic Republic of the Congo before it became a colonial possession. Instead, it was the personal property of King Leopold II. It was not part of the Belgian government or anything like that. It was his personal property or his own estate for which to do whatever he wanted, which apparently was horrific war crimes, which ended up with Belgium having to intervene and put it under colonial administration because their king was such a bloodthirsty and ruthless tyrant that he had to have this property taken away from him because of the human rights abuses by 1870s and 1880s humanitarian standards. Think about that for a second and how horrifying that must have been. And so, in response to Leopold basically creating this free state out of thin air, basically, all the various powers of Europe got together. So, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, the French, the British, the Ottoman Empire, the Portuguese, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all these different powers got together, the Italians even, they all got together in the Berlin Conference of 1884 to figure out how they could most gentlemanly agree on how to split up and accept competing claims in Africa. And that's why between 1870 and 1914, a span of less than 45 years, they went from controlling 10% of Africa to 90% of Africa. And it was a scramble. So the borders and zones of influence and control were done very willy-nilly and without much care or respect for locals and their traditions and their neighbors and different religions. And you see the problem, right? So this is where we end up in 1895 with French West Africa. And then you also had French Equatorial Africa / Central Africa. That one involved Cameroon, Gabon, French Congo, the Central African Republic, and Chad. These would come to play a significant role in the decades to come, but this also shows again just how much of Africa was conquered, most of it arguably by the British and the French. And so this is where we end with the scramble of Africa and the subjugation and arbitrary borders thrown around West and Central Africa that would eventually come to haunt these peoples to this day and be a source of much strife and trouble and problems and economic malaise to this day. But that's a subject for another video. But it just really shows that without much care or planning, purely for power and prestige and for money, people were abused and exploited and taken advantage of, and treaties were ignored because of a sense of moral superiority and being the better civilization. And all for cash crops and for property and for a pissing match against a fellow European power is why Africa is so messed up to this day. And that's what's bothering me today.